All right. I think, Sada, we should start. It is on
Yes,
the dot
yes,
of
we can
8.
start now.
All right. So,
I think
good.
the camera you have to keep down. Yes,
Okay.
yes, perfect.
All right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us once again today. This is let me check. This is our seventh GCM objective that we will be discussing today. As you know, this is a series of the 20. It's a series of looking at the 23 objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. We still have a long way to go, but we are happy that we have come up to the seventh. And in today's discussion, we are going to look at vulnerabilities and reducing vulnerabilities in migration. We have a fantastic panel with us again, like last week. We have a panel of 6, but and we will try to keep this as interactive as possible. We all understand that it is always a challenge of these webinars when we to have an interactive discussion. So we will try as much as possible, like in all the previous webinars, to keep it interactive and engaging as possible for all the 200 plus people that join us in this discussion. Um, Let me start with then looking at objective 7, and just to begin with, kind of looking at objective 7 in relation to SDGs. And if there is a principle in the SDGs that I would link it to, it would be of leaving no one behind. Largely because we talk of vulnerable populations or vulnerabilities in migration. And the whole question is, I think we have to today ask ourselves, is are migrants really vulnerable? Or are they in vulnerable situations? What causes this vulnerability? And how do we address these situations that migrants find them in? One of the things during this COVID that has become very evident is this principle of the SDGs of leaving no one behind. This has been not a guiding principle of response and action in this time of the COVID. So this is something for us to really think about, of how migrant workers, migrant communities, many of them have, in a certain sense, been left stranded and abandoned and adrift in many ways. How do we address this objective in relation to that principle? Uh, as we build back better, then understanding vulnerabilities for what they are in terms of context and situations that increase vulnerabilities that migrants that find themselves in. The panel will, in today's discussion, we will look at, is it possible to get rid of it? What is the opposite of vulnerability? So we want to look at in a SDG kind of framework of goals and targets. How would we look at the opposite end of vulnerability? Where do we want to reach? And is it possible at all? Or will migration always be fraught with vulnerabilities or vulnerable situations? And if we are going to address this, and particularly as we come out of this COVID situation, out of this pandemic situation, as we talk of big frameworks, build back better, the call of the UN, what does that mean in relation then to GCM Objective 7? What does addressing vulnerabilities in relation to GCM Objective 7 mean? What does the new social contract that we are talking about in so many different circles? There is at the moment, as countries, governments, stakeholders, institutions think of that maybe we are coming to the end of the pandemic in the sense of the possibility of a vaccine is going to be at hand, kind of thing. Uh, are we looking at how objective 7 in terms of what causes vulnerabilities? Can we, in the building back better, configure it in the design so that the next phase of migration, or the migration that we will see coming out of COVID, the type of migration, the migration journey coming out of COVID, Will it still be fraught with those vulnerabilities, or can we put in programs, mechanisms, processes that will reduce that, so we can see that we are beginning to address this to a point that we can even say in terms of GCM indicators and goals that we have kind of addressed this or are addressing this. And for that, we have a fantastic panel. Let me begin with, we will, and in this order of the speakers as well. We will start with Dr. Patrick Duigan, who is from the IOM, and he is the regional migration health advisor with the IOM in the regional office for Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok. In his capacity, he provides both support and advice to IOM country missions, governments, and local and regional and global partners to promote the migration health agenda. I'm sure Patrick will have much to say with regard to the pandemic and relation to vulnerabilities and migrant workers. So, Patrick, really looking to look at you, to hear you, to see how you set this up for us. Following Patrick, we will have Ignacio Pactor, a long-time activist and colleague of ours, who is currently the executive director of ICWA, the Global Consortium of Humanitarian NGOs. ICWA and Ignacio has been very, very involved in pushing a rights-based approach both to humanitarian work, but also within the GCM and in the discussions around this. And we have collaborated and worked together for some years now. He's an expert on human rights and social issues, and we are very grateful that he is with us today. We also have, following Ignacio, Ellen Sana, who is from the Philippines, who is an active migrant rights advocate, has been so for many, many years now, specializing in women's rights, specializing in advocacy strategies, and in engagement with countries of destination in many ways in advancing the rights of Filipino migrant workers. But she has also played a key role in many intergovernmental processes, both advising governments and engaging governments in how to respond from a rights-based approach to migration. So thank you, Ellen, for joining us as well. Following Ellen, we will have Irene Lorenzo from UNICEF, and Irene has worked on child migration and displacement at UNICEF since 2012. She is currently representing UNICEF in the executive committee of the UN Migration Network in the two network working groups that UNICEF co-leads on alternatives to detention, return, and reintegration. It would be fantastic to hear from her on the whole situation of children and young people in the context of migration. And we know that there is today a lot more space for youth in global discourse, largely because of the work that Irene and her colleagues have done in the last few years, which have brought the youth now to the front of of migration discourse at international and regional level. So great to have you on board as well, Irene. And then we have Sandra Federici, who is a journalist, and she's since 1999 she has held the position of director of the African Mediterranean ANO, a biennial review that publishes articles on African artistic expression in all its forms, including literature, theater, dance, comics, and art. And she has been very involved in looking at how education plays a key role. She's participated in the steering committee on the project Snapshot from the Borders. So it will be interesting to see what Sandra has to say about what happens at the borders. And we know that a lot of these vulnerabilities play out at the borders. They don't, of course, in the context of work and things like that, but we have seen, and this is what happened in 2015, that whole situation of the boats and things like that brought out and highlighted to the international community the situation at the borders. And very recently we have seen some of these stories as well. So it was great to have Irene on board. And last but not the least, we have Helen Brandt from who from and Helen Brandt is the Asia Pacific Senior Migration and Displacement Officer for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. She provides technical, strategic, and operational support in the context of migration and displacement to Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies across the Asia Pacific region. But I know Helen also as being very keenly engaged in looking at this issue in even in intergovernmental spaces, and participating with civil society and other stakeholders in many consultations that we have had in the region, bringing that particular perspective of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies as they reach out to migrants and communities that are particularly vulnerable, that and in many situations have no one else to reach out to except the Red Crescent and Red Cross societies. So it's very great to have this kind of panel. It's very great to have this kind of panel with us today, and we will and listen to them. But I asked the panel as well to keep your interventions very, keep it if you possible up to 6 minutes. We will try to do 3 rounds with you. Begin with your kind of framing of your issue, then we will do, and you can feel free to build up on anything each of the other panelists have said. Then we go to the floor, we take some questions there, we get your responses, intersperse you with some of those responses, and then we come back to you at the end, if that's okay. So at least we hear from you thrice in this duration. So I'm hoping we can keep that discipline, and looking forward to your inputs and the inputs of the rest of the people currently in this webinar. Thank you so much, and let me then hand the floor over to you, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much, William, and thank you for having me here. So, when discussing the issue of vulnerabilities of migrants and addressing those vulnerabilities, I think the COVID pandemic has not only brought some new vulnerabilities, but even more so has really taken the lid off the existing vulnerabilities for a lot of migrant populations that have been there, and that many of us and many of those on the call, I'm sure, have been advocating for many years. But really they've come to a fore during this COVID pandemic, and really being playing out, and perhaps for the first time being recognised by society at large as really critically important factors. So considering the vulnerabilities, particularly in the context of COVID, but looking at the GCM, there's several different things I think we need to think about. One is that there are increased health vulnerabilities in terms of, whilst migrants have the same biological risks as citizens and non-migrant populations to the virus itself, their ability to be able to follow the public health interventions, the risks associated with crowded and cramped living conditions, collective shelters, dormitories, lack of access to water and sanitation and other services, really mean that for many migrants, there is heightened vulnerability just because of the social determinants that they find themselves in. And this can be, at their origin, because of the conditions that drive them to migrate, during transit, as well as in destination, where often their access to sort of basic hygiene, to social distancing and ability to follow those is impacted. Secondly, there's compromised access to health services in many settings, where and this has been highlighted in many situations with COVID, that because of lack of access to services, because of language barriers or cultural barriers, because of stigma and discrimination, because of either unintentional or intentional exclusion from health services, financial barriers, and other different factors, that migrants, if they are affected by COVID or are affected by illness, can have a disproportionate vulnerability for there to be negative because of lack of access to healthcare, leading to delays in diagnosis, insufficient treatment, and the negative consequences of that. Thirdly, we're seeing, associated with the global economic conditions which are deteriorating, rising unemployment and loss of livelihood of migrants. And in many places, we're seeing countries also starting to enact policies to try and reduce the reliance on migrant workers. And so this is having significant impact on the ability of migrants, particularly migrant workers, to be able to cater for their basic needs for themselves as well as their families back at home, which links also back to impact on remittances. And again, that's having a significant impact on the vulnerabilities of migrants, but also their households and their communities back in home regions. So all of these factors combined are really exacerbating the underlying vulnerabilities, and I think the COVID pandemic is really highlighting those and making them significantly worse for people. There's also implications of the extensive travel and movement restrictions, which we've seen globally. There has never before been, such extensive and such a long-standing interruption to global travel, which means in some cases migrants are stuck and unable to return home. In other cases, there's many more barriers that they face in terms of cost barriers, in terms of quarantine, in terms of testing and medical requirements to be able to move, which again is making them in more vulnerable conditions and more vulnerable situations, which when we think taking all of these factors into account in terms of health risks, in terms of lack of access to healthcare, in terms of socioeconomic impacts and in impacts on mobility, this creates the sort of conditions where migrants can be driven to have to resort to more risky behaviours in terms of unable to follow lockdowns, having to continue to find work, potentially having to become irregular in terms of their migration status if visa extensions are not being granted. And so there's these multiple different factors, I think, which are coming together to really create, unfortunately, a perfect storm in terms of the vulnerabilities facing migrants. And although in some countries there's been some improvements in terms of the COVID cases, and in a few select examples, which perhaps we'll discuss later, there's been some very good responses from government and civil society in responding to these challenges for migrants. In many other situations, those responses haven't yet come to the fore, and I think a lot more needs to be done by all stakeholders, by governments, by civil society, by society at large, to really look at meaningful migrant inclusion, because the reality is if migrants are not being included within COVID response, if these vulnerabilities are not being addressed, then no one is safe until everyone is safe. Taking inclusive approaches to reducing those vulnerabilities is actually going to be improving public health for society at large. And I think by addressing the vulnerabilities for COVID and focusing on the current acute situation, hopefully we can look at changes to the way that migrants are treated in society, that these vulnerabilities are addressed into the long term, and to look at sustainable change. I'll just stop there because I think that's my 6 minutes, but happy to expound further as we go on.
For sure, Patrick, and I like what you've said, and I like what you started by saying is that there have been new vulnerabilities have come up, and I think that is the stark reality today of situation of many migrants. I am almost tempted to ask you, and I know what you might your quick answer might be, but I'll ask you to think about it, and I'll come back to you after some time. But do you see change happening? Do you think that the GCM Objective 7 or even the SDGs has been useful for governments in this time of addressing this? And if it has it been really pockets here and there kind of thing? Or is this something that governments are learning from each other and moving? And I'm saying, where is the hope? Where is the hope? Is this if new vulnerabilities are there, and you started by saying the old vulnerabilities just got further exasperated kind of thing, right? So if we were struggling with so much of the old vulnerabilities and now a new one, top it up kind of thing, where is the hope? Is it with one or two governments? Is it in processes? And I know as a IOM, because of your engagement so much on the ground and with governments, do you see a shift? Can you say that yes, coming out we'll be in a much better position than when we got into it? So think about it, and I'll come back to you. Ignacio, you've got you've been advocating for this for a long time, kind of thing, and I know that you have seen mixed populations as well. It's not only with migrants but with the refugees, asylum seekers. So the scope of your work is tremendous in terms of the different populations you've kind of looked at as well. And from your members on the ground, groups that respond to this situation, what are you hearing? What are you hearing? And what do you think in the building back better should be our focus? Ignacio.
Thank you, William, and really appreciated also Patrick's intervention And then William, you come with many questions, and I know, as you said, we have 3 slots. So I'm only going to tackle a few of the questions because you have really many, and it's with humility that we have to address the questions. I would first say the overall, to respond directly to your question, what we're hearing from members, what we are seeing, what we are living, major concerns, of course, on how the legal obligations related to access to protection under humanitarian, under international human rights and refugee law, and also as well as practices are a major concern, are being challenged. The risks of reducing the beneficial impact of migration is clearly there, and there's evidence out there. There are, of course, good examples, and if we have time, we can cover some around how some countries are reacting. But overall, we know it's a huge concern out there. What I would like to do first, in my first round, if you may, William, is to go back a little bit to 2018 and to remind ourselves what have states committed to in the Objective 7 of the GCM. Then I would certainly want to develop, and perhaps that's for the next round of inputs and linking to the conversations and what other speakers are going to bring, is to talk around 3 crises. And I think Patrick certainly covered a lot around the health crisis. We have the socio-economic crisis, and then linked directly to Objective 7 is the protection crisis. And that's why I think it's worth going back. What do we have in the Objective 7? And then afterwards, certainly I have elements of reflections of way forwards. Where is the hope? Of course, there is always hope. And 4 things that may configure or help design the building back better, which I hope I would have time to share. So now if we go back to 2018 and to what we do have on an intergovernmentally negotiated and agreed outcome, Objective 7, to address and reduce the vulnerabilities in migration. A few points. One is how civil society organizations, but of course not only, really pushed for it to finish where we have 12 points of action. I remember with the draft 0, it was 7, and it was pushed to have 12 points of action. We have to anchor discussions on those 12 points of action in different conversations, including at the national level. And the way it is organized, it was more specific for state commitments to be clearly laid out and the actions to be taken. I would like to come back to a few reflections also linking to what you said in the introduction, William, around vulnerability. And what we have there is that we have a kind of open-ended, we don't have an open-ended description of vulnerabilities in there. And that is a bit of a problem. But at the same time, and very important for the state interventions, the Objective 7 does cover a great amount of vulnerabilities. It could have gone a bit further, but it includes also the vulnerabilities created by state authorities themselves. I'm sure Irene, because we worked on this together, would really be covering a lot around children and women, which in the 0 draft actually were almost the 2 key vulnerable groups that were mentioned. And it's as time went on in the negotiations that it was something more comprehensive. Now, there is the recognition that migrants face multiple forms of vulnerability. That's something that we've really discussed within the GCM on this Objective 7. So and it does place human rights at the center of states' action. I know even if we see it seems not to always be followed at the moment, it's really good to remind what we have grounded in some texts and continuously go back to it. Another very positive element that we have there that I think is very, very relevant to our situation now is the acknowledgement that there are legal and practical impediments within destination states. So that's linked to work abuse and to irregular migration. So having laid down a few of the elements of the achievements that we have, certainly I concur with William and Patrick, of course, on how we are very much being challenged, on how there are new vulnerabilities, on how the group of vulnerable people is just increasing. Vulnerable situations are just becoming even more vulnerable. And this is true, particularly, of course, for migrants such as the ones in irregular situations, migrant workers with precarious livelihoods, or people working in the informal economy, victims of trafficking. We certainly hear also from the humanitarian context, the increase of situations of gender-based violence on vulnerable groups, internally displaced people and asylum seekers, even if this is mainly covered by the Global Compact on refugees, certainly enters into the discussion when you're working on operations in the different contexts that we see. I'll stop here then, William, for the 6 minutes, and I know that you invite me again on 2 opportunities. One, to talk a bit further on how I perceive the protection crisis, and really to identify it as a crisis in itself, and that really links strongly to our advocacy work on Objective 7. And then also I have 4 things to indicate where hope is and where we should be working.
Thank you, and I will come back to you on the protection crisis. I think that is going to be crucial to the discussion in like we heard in one of the previous webinars, that protection should not be something that is a reaction to a situation, but protection should be inbuilt into the building back program kind of thing. So it would be really good to hear your ideas on that. And hope, you have always given hope, so I'll come back to you on that point as well to see where. But Patrick, I'll come back to you to ask you to think a little more deeper in terms of when you're looking at which countries or where it has been useful to look at some examples. If you could identify countries in the region of Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, that would be fantastic, or even Latin America. But let me come to Ellen Sana now. And Ellen, you have been very, very engaged in I don't know for how many years now in advocating for the rights of migrant workers, ever since I've known you, and that seems to be a very, very long time kind of thing. But and I've seen that a large part of your work has focused on women migrant workers as well. And in your own experience today, and as you look back, and I know you've been now you're even preparing, I heard this morning, a shadow report for CEDAW and things like that. So you have seen this, you have struggled with it, you have engaged government with it, and particularly your own government. So in many ways, where the rest of the world looks at Philippines as a standard bearer for rights and protections and things like that, you have been constant in pointing out gaps and vulnerabilities and challenges, while you recognize some efforts have been made as well in terms of protection. So what are your thoughts on this situation, particularly when it comes to women migrant workers, and where states respond to vulnerable situations of women migrant workers by banning? let's put a ban, let's stop the deployment because they are very vulnerable. How do you as a women's rights activist, migrant rights activist, take to that view, and what kind of uh, alternatives then do you propose, Ellen?
Hi, William. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you on the GCM 7, that is Objective 7, that is addressing and reducing the vulnerabilities in migration. And I think, William, the words were carefully chosen to address and reduce. So, meaning it's not like there is hope that they will be totally eliminated. And let me address that as I go with my presentation. I drafted for the first round so that I will meet the 6 minute time. So let me start. The GCM was adopted end of 2018, but before we had time to even draft our respective ambitious national response to the GCM, here we are already being challenged with the COVID-19 pandemic, which impacts on all of us, with migrant workers as one of the hardest hit sectors as well. Can the principles of the MICIC, migrants in countries in crisis, whose context was more political conflicts and wars than health pandemics, combined with the GCM objectives, stand the litmus test posed by the COVID-19 pandemic? In particular, can we address and reduce the vulnerabilities of migrants per GCM Objective 7? Pre-COVID times, migrants are already considered a vulnerable population because while, and this is my elaboration in this, is while their human and labor rights remain intact in our being, the laws and policies that express them are not always present where they are working and living in, and where this exists, these policies and laws, effective implementation will always be a challenge. ILO estimates in 2017 put migrant workers around the globe at 164 million. 68 million of these are women migrants, or 41%, noting a 9% increase in the last 4 years from 2013 to 2017. Migrant domestic workers numbered 11.5 million, with women domestic workers comprising 8.45 million, or 73.4% of all migrant domestic workers. In the case of the Philippines, 56% of our migrants in 2019 were women, with 62, like I repeat, 62.5% in domestic work. These women migrant workers are disproportionately vulnerable to abuse and exploitation because of the nature of their work, more so under COVID times, the migration channels they go through, and overall low regard of society for domestic work, which is performed primarily by women migrants, an occupation which is hardly covered by labor and social laws, undervalued, unrecognized, informal, precarious, and because it is a woman's work. That said, measures and initiatives have been undertaken to address and reduce their vulnerabilities at all stages of the migration cycle, I must add. For example, apart from national policies to protect all migrant workers, and this is the case in the Philippines, there is a set of policies that seek to protect particularly migrant domestic workers at all stages of the migration cycle. For example, recruitment agencies are prohibited from collecting placement fees from prospective migrant domestic workers. This way, they are not supposed to end up in debt bandage. Part of the protection, also, quote unquote, regime is that they must go through recruitment agencies because we have a law that puts the recruitment agencies in the Philippines and the foreign employer in joint and several liability relationship. On site, our laws provide for social welfare attaches where there is high concentration of women migrant workers. We also have a gender focal point officer to ensure in this that there is gender responsiveness in the responses of the post. And this is under the Magna Carta of Women in the Philippines. Upon return, there is also reintegration package exclusive for low-wage domestic workers. Needless to say, policies and programs are in place at all levels of governance, from national national to local, guided not only by national laws but by ILO 189 on decent work for domestic workers, where the Philippines is a party to, by General Recommendation 26 and the entire CEDAW Convention, ILO 1 Convention 190, and the CMW, of course, to cite a few of these normative framework. And yet, our women migrants continue to be vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Why is this so? One, gaps in access to information of migrants and prospective migrants. For women in rural areas and far-flung areas where illegal recruiters and as unscrupulous elements thrive. And this is very much so in the case of the Philippines, which is archipelagic islands, so they can easily isolate themselves in the islands far from the town centers and urban centers. Gaps in accessibility of programs and services, and even the appropriateness of some of these programs and services too. More often than not, these are concentrated in urban centers, not enabling and there is no enabling environment for women workers to access such. Lapses and gaps in coordination between and among service providers, line agencies of government, missions, and the mother offices in the capitals. Effective implementation, monitoring, and even evaluation of policies, programs, and services are very much wanting too. Strong push factors for women to migrate for work because of poverty, but also because they end up not in the labor force in their own countries, like in the Philippines. Like 55% of our women workers are not in the labor force because they have to do the unpaid care work in the households. So they think that the better option is to leave the country. But they, of course, they ended up doing domestic work, the same work, but this time it is paid care work. What do we do? Well, we have in CMA, one of the things we are doing is this building and strengthening the network of support for women migrant workers. Just this early afternoon, we had our online convening in Mindanao area. So we had like 66 participants combined from local government, national government, and migrant organizations in attendance. And we are all together in trying to build, strengthen, and expand the network of support for women migrant workers. We conduct capacity building on migrants' rights, gender and migration, social costs of migration, and equipping them, how they can be of help to their distressed migrant constituencies. We engage in information and education work. I think we must not get tired of reaching out to the communities to engage with them on migrants' rights issues. We assist migrants in organizing their ranks. What are the challenges that we have experienced? Desperation of a job, this is our observation, sometimes or oftentimes actually wins in the end, and takes the better of them or the worst of them, of our women migrants. That is how they know the perils of it, but then they will go just the same. How to engage the migration narrative? This is another challenge, from one out of desperation to one where migrants are needed by countries of destination, and where migrants have options to stay because there are decent jobs available for them in the country of origin. For the latter, I am not optimistic at this time. Actually, have not been for a very, very long time, for sure. It is very sad that you can actually hear now in the Philippines, when the migrants are back in the country, that, oh, they will be competing for the jobs in the country, in the Philippines. And we thought that we only hear it in the countries of destination, when the local workers there would think that the migrants are stealing their jobs from them. But now we are hearing also, and I hope this doesn't become the narrative in the months to come, that the migrants who have been back in the country are going to be competitors of the workers, the local workers in the countries. Yeah, so that's one thing. Okay, let me continue. Also, another issue, another challenge is to develop and offer more job options for women. The usual response of government to abuses against migrant women is to stop the deployment. Evidence has it that this does not work. What can work is when women workers have equal opportunities for decent jobs back home. Yeah, maybe that's one way to effectively discourage them from taking the migration option, but they can only discourage. And the other part is, but the main challenge is also how society in general regards women and women's work. that women have agencies, that they have capacities just as any other beings, that household work must not only be the domain of women, but by all members of the household. And I think I end my first round of intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for that. I think you raised some very good issues there, but I will ask you to do some introspection on your own reflection, kind of thing, and the way you have positioned migrant workers and women migrant workers and the question of domestic workers. Do you think now there is a plenty of hope in the air, kind of thing, largely because the world has come to recognize in this COVID how important domestic workers are, because now they have a new category. They are called essential workers, or they fit within the essential workers category. So is this a great thing that has happened for domestic workers, and is the world going to change for them coming out of COVID, kind of thing? I'll put that question for you to think of. The other question I'll put for you to think about is do you think vulnerability is attached to the fact that your Philippines is a country of origin? The power dynamic between the desperation of a country of origin to deploy workers, does that is that a part of the design into which vulnerability is built because of the power differentiation and negotiation, the desperation that workers have to leave the country and look for overseas employment, that desperation causes or attracts vulnerability or breeds vulnerability, is something I want you to think about. Patrick, you have a country in Asia. Can you name a country in Asia? Patrick?
Yes, yes, sorry. Can you just
Can,
repeat the question? Yeah,
do you have a country in Asia that you can name?
I can name many, many countries in Asia, but I mean, just taking the example of the Philippines, for example, I mean, and in relation to the GCM, I mean, Duterte, in his remarks to the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago, specifically mentioned the Global Compact of Migration and the importance of using this as a tool in the context of COVID, as well as in the context of encouraging other member states to take it forward.
But and you think this is I know he has done this. I know there are other heads of states also that have done this. I know there was a statement made also by the Bangladeshi Prime Minister and things like that. But these calls, are they calls in desperation, or are they calls that bring about a working program?
I mean, I think it's a bit too early to sort of to say there's no hope. And there certainly has been hope. I think there has been some quite good examples of countries that have taken measures to start using the GCM and using these types of things and to respond to COVID, but also to look at the longer term change. So we have the good examples, and always the good examples promoting migrants' rights and migration of Philippines and Nepal and Bangladesh, those sending countries. The countries like Thailand has had some very good approaches to its COVID response in terms of migrant inclusion, in terms of setting up multilingual hotlines for migrants, in terms of including migrants within social protection mechanisms, and really addressing that as vulnerabilities. And interestingly, even some countries that haven't signed on to the GCM, thinking of a specific example of Singapore, where there was a very severe situation of differences between migrant populations and Singapore citizens with regards to COVID, actually as a result have taken some strong steps towards improving the vulnerabilities and addressing access to healthcare, improving building new dormitory accommodation, improving those work accommodation, and even I've seen some social movements amongst Singapore society to start looking at why to start thinking about how Singapore as a country treats migrant workers and sort of citizen-based movements to say we should be protecting and promoting these migrant workers and not having them out of sight, out of mind as they have been in the past, but really thinking about what do we want as a society to take care of these populations who really are essential workers for our community. And I think, unfortunately, it took the COVID situation for them to see that, and the vast differences in prevalence of COVID between migrant workers in dormitory accommodations and others. But as a result of that, we've seen changes to government policies, changes to societal responses and changes to sort of attitudes towards migrants in terms of addressing these vulnerabilities in the long term. Now, interestingly, in the case of Singapore, they haven't used the GCM per se, but they have taken this approach. So I think for those countries that have signed up for the GCM, that can be a guiding force to do it, but it's not absolutely necessary to only use that as a framework. I think the principles of universal health coverage, of the Sustainable Development Goals, of accessibility and inclusion, are sort of universal principles that and how they are implemented depends on, I think, the different vulnerabilities and capacities of the country.
Thanks for that, Patrick. And I like what you pointed out in the sense of there are now citizens. The COVID has led to a lot of citizens movements, social movements in country across regions and things like that, that have brought to the fore the need to recognize migrant workers as part of society. And I think this has been at least one kind of indicator or a shift, let us say, where this kind of recognition has happened. It is a pity that it took COVID to bring us to this realization. But for the longest time, where migrants have been the outsider, and in many countries of destination, Singapore included, is fantastic. Singapore is a classic example of this, actually, when they actually thought they had beaten the virus and were about to celebrate when it broke out in one of the accommodations in the and that started becoming a cluster, and then that spread, and then they realized, oh my God, the migrants and their accommodations is a vector for the virus, kind of thing, and we've got to do something about it. It was like a forgotten population was suddenly recognized, kind of thing. But I like that, and I think that's important for us to look at what the SDGs and the GCM talk about inclusion, and how do we break that out to see what that means. But thank you for that. Let me come to Irene then. And Irene, one of the, and we heard Ignacio talk about this as well, and I know that the two of you worked on this as well, in terms of bringing a very special focus of youth and children, kind of thing, into this GCM discussion, and even had probably one of the most organized sectoral kind of papers in this, a very good strategy that played out, which went, that you all got a lot into the GCM as well from that perspective. You want to share your thoughts then on Objective 7, and where you are currently looking at how it is playing out?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William, and everyone for this invitation. This is the first time that UNICEF participates in this series, so I would like to start by a few general thoughts about what the Global Compact for Migration means for children and young people, and then I will go into Objective 7, if that's okay. First of all, by making child sensitivity one of the 10 guiding principles of the Compact, a principle that cuts across all of the 23 objectives, governments have recognized that children are central to migration management. So for the first time, children are not a footnote and they're not an afterthought. They're not relegated to a separate objective, and they're not only seen through the lens of vulnerability. Instead, in the Compact, governments acknowledge that they must pay attention to children and their rights, not only because they need protection, but because laws, policies, and practices that ignore children are really ineffective. When children fall through the cracks, migration systems fail. The key ask of the Compact is rooted in the CRC, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's really very simple. Treat every migrant child as a child first, so that migration can be a positive and an empowering experience for all children. Not only children who migrate, but also children who stay behind in countries of origin, undocumented children in countries of destination, etc. All of the spectrum of how migration affects children is included in the Compact. So in other words, the Compact asks to focus on potential instead of vulnerability, and on inclusion instead of marginalization. At least that's how we are seeing it. And this is also why I cannot focus only on Objective 7 today, and why I don't want to talk about how migrant children are vulnerable. This core ask of the Compact is also crucial because it really identifies rightly what's at the core of so many migration management practices that put children at risk, that put children in so-called vulnerable situations. And in the end, if you look at it, it's nothing else than discrimination. Discrimination explains why migrant children don't access national systems and end up in parallel structures under the care of immigration authorities instead of child protection authorities. Discrimination also explains why immigration detention is justified as a protective measure for children, even if detaining children to protect them would never be acceptable for national children in any country. And discrimination explains why most states don't grant undocumented migrant children the level of healthcare that they afford to national children. This call to non-discrimination in the compact is not abstract, which is really good and was really welcomed by us. It is unpacked in many concrete actions under each objective of the GCM. And these actions are all interlinked, and of course, are not just the actions where children are explicitly mentioned. So actually, if you were to do a word search for child, you would miss the actions that are most relevant to children and to address their vulnerability. So if we take objective 7, because that's the focus of our webinar today, but we could take any other objective, we see that actions E and F, for example, focus on best interest procedures, the role of child protection authorities, safeguards for unaccompanied children, etc. Very concrete child protection issues. So these are all policy areas where there was already a relatively solid political consensus before the compact was adopted. And these are measures that have momentum behind them and have had momentum behind them for a while. And I would love to go into details in terms of promising practices that we see in all regions regarding these practices. But I will continue, and I'll get back to that in my second round if there is time for that or interest in that. I will already mention, for example, that the recently adopted EU Pact on Migration and Asylum has a section on children that has all of the right language in terms of safeguards, in terms of protection, procedures, best interests, etc. Now, what about the actions in Objective 7 that do not mention children, such as the actions A or H or I? These actions call for reviewing policies that exacerbate vulnerabilities, and the most important of all, for establishing pathways to regular status. And I really cannot think of two actions that would be more urgent to protect migrant children in vulnerable situations for real and in the long term. But here, of course, the picture of state practices is not so encouraging, and also consensus around them is also not so solid, especially because some governments see increasing vulnerability as an explicit goal of their migration policy, explicit or implicit, because they hope that it will act as a deterrent. Despite that, we are seeing some progress in these areas, partly also because of the COVID context. Now, I will go back in a second to the trends we are seeing during the COVID pandemic. But first, I want to outline quickly what UNICEF has been doing since the compact was adopted to turn vulnerability into opportunity for migrant children, to reply, William, to your question in your introductory remarks. So this is where we see the hope. In terms of the what, we're focusing on 4 thematic priorities. One is ending child migration detention. The second is promoting child-sensitive returns and reintegration. The third is ensuring inclusion of migrant children in national and local systems and services, of course, regardless of status. And the fourth is strengthening cooperation of child protection actors across borders. Now, in terms of how we're doing this, we are mainly following 2 strategies. The first, as you were mentioning, is bringing children and young people to the table as partners. We are committed to do nothing about them without them, and to include new voices in the conversation. So we are investing in interpretation, in facilitation, in skills development, and we're also systematically connecting young partners, both those that are engaged in UN global conversations and working at the grassroots level, so both levels, with the day-to-day work of our offices all across the world in all regions, and also with the work of other UN entities and other actors. And maybe here I wanna say a disclaimer that when I say children and young people, I'm talking about local activists, community leaders, young researchers, entrepreneurs, frontline workers, national and local government officials, etc. These youth have a connection to migration that is both personal and professional. And of course, we want to co-design programs with them. We don't want to invite them to tell their challenging migration story at a panel discussion at risk of re-traumatizing them. That's not what we're talking about. I will just skip the concrete examples of progress in terms of youth engagement and participation. I will just mention that we see the regional reviews of the compact that are coming in the coming months as a real crucial opportunity to establish children and youth as key actors who will keep governments accountable. And this is not only as part of civil society, but also as part of government delegations, and not only as participants in stakeholder consultations, but also as speakers along with governments. Now, moving to our second strategy or way of working, we have focused on creating spaces for peer learning among governments and other actors on two key issues: alternatives to detention and returns and reintegration. And these are two core migration management issues that we see as the two sides of the coin of the COVID pandemic. Regarding detention, we think that the current crisis presents a tiny window of opportunity to show how migration governance without detention looks like in practice, because alternatives to detention have emerged as a viable solution to mitigate public health concerns, but also to protect the rights of migrants and give them access to services. And on the contrary, we see how states are using the pandemic to step up forced returns of migrants without due process, using this opportunity to stigmatize migrants even more and to close borders. So some examples of our work towards ending child migration detention, I will just mention for the sake of time that we have partnered with the International Detention Coalition to convene a global multi-stakeholder platform to support states in addressing the practical challenges they face when putting in place alternatives to detention. So we had meetings in all regions with the exception of Europe since the compact was adopted. And we're really looking at this as an open space for government experts to discuss common challenges, share progress, exchange positive and not so positive practices, and also to build the capacity of experts through meetings and through sites visits. Now, on returns, to conclude, we are planning to bring governments together also across migration corridors to mitigate some of the most worrying trends that we're seeing with forced returns in the context of COVID, because here the numbers are really staggering. For example, since March, the US has expelled over 150,000 asylum seekers and migrants, including 8,800 unaccompanied children, who have been sent back without due process and without consideration of their best interests, in many cases to violent conditions that threaten their life in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. In Africa, 40,000 children have been returned to West Africa and Central Africa, including 12,000 to Niger only. Over 1,500 have been returned from Iran to Afghanistan. And only until August, we had at least 1,600 migrant children returned to Ethiopia, mainly from the Gulf. So just to conclude, my three key takeaways for you to put children and youth at the core of the GCM implementation would be: first, partner with migrant children and youth and look at them through the lens of vulnerability. Second, bring governments together to learn from each other. And the more sensitive, political, and divisive is the issue, the more potential there is for engaging constructively and shifting the dial on some issues, as we have seen or are starting to see on the issue of immigration detention. And third, we see the pandemic as creating opportunities to make progress on some GCM objectives. And at the same time, is providing governments with good cover to backslide even on some of their most basic commitments in the GCM, such as non-refoulement, as Ignacio was saying. So this means that we have to seize this opportunity to reimagine some migration management practices where we can, but also to doing risk mitigation and holding the line on other core issues. So it is really not only about building back better and reimagining, but about holding the line and standing up for some of the core values and the core vision of the GCM. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks a lot. And of course, happy to share examples, more materials, information, promising, not so promising practices, concrete ideas in terms of UNICEF's work, etc. Over.
No, thanks, Irene, and for sharing a lot of the work that you all have been doing as UNICEF. But also thanks for recognizing, and the contradiction that we see in our daily lives, and this is so evident in the UN system kind of thing that we have. The most ratified human rights convention will be the rights of the child kind of thing. Who wouldn't, which country would dare not to ratify the rights of the child convention in the sense, because children are children and we recognize them as our future of society, future of community, future of families. Our very future as a race hangs on our children kind of thing. And yet we know, and we've seen this, we've got friends now on this call from the Latin American region, from the Central American region. We've seen over the years, and we see this continually till today, that the most advanced developed countries in the world don't treat migrant children as children of the future. We see that, we hear stories every day from the most developed countries of the world. kind of taking these kind of responses. So how much of this speak which comes in documents, and yes, we have this and a lot of this kind of UN speak language kind of thing, which all of us can subscribe to, because of the fear of not subscribing to it puts us in this situation where, okay, and how much of it could be something what Patrick was saying, like the notion, the realization of inclusion, where migrant children would be seen as our children. What do we have against children? As host countries, as developed countries, as countries that host welcome migrant workers, asylum seekers, refugee populations, whatever you might have it kind of thing in terms of mobile populations. What prevents society from recognizing these children as the future of humanity, and therefore, at least within this category of not putting up those barriers, not putting up the kind of responses that we have? Aside, because I don't think these kind of, I'm wondering if these policy kind of documents and frameworks and things like that, alternatives to detention, how many children do they affect? Like how many children in detention or caught up in those situations does an alternative to detention program really have an impact on? And how many children will continue to remain in that situation of detention for years and live the trauma of that? How do we assess our progress that we are making in this regard? This is something I think we must have I think this conversation on children has to go to a much more deeper kind of conversation, from documents to a real realization of children, at least in children, whether migrant or nationals or citizens, or don't fall within any of those categories. They should just be seen as children. And this is something I'm wondering if when you come back on to see if there is work that UNICEF is looking at in how to change that social environment kind of thing, it might be useful. But let me now come to Sandra. And Sandra, you've been at the borders. You've been looking at these pictures. You've been looking at the response, and you've been putting them. You've been capturing that and putting them out in journals, in stories, and we see that it flashes in our news. It flashes in newspapers, magazines, cable TV. We see all this kind of thing, and there is almost an immunity to what we are seeing now, that in terms of the vulnerabilities, and yet people like you continue with this, of bringing these stories to the front, telling these stories and raising your voice in this regard. In your own experience then today, and as you look at vulnerabilities, and particularly now in this time of the COVID and things, like Patrick says, new vulnerabilities have been identified, have come up. What are you seeing today as you organize yourself around this particular corridor of Africa and Europe and the Mediterranean? Sandra.
Okay, thank you, William, and Forum for Migration in Asia for inviting me. I will share you some ideas, some thoughts from the Lampedusa point of view, the Lampedusa Island point of view, because I'm involved, and we were involved in this meeting, because we are dealing the Snapshots from the Borders project. Snapshot from the Borders is a 3-year project co-funded by the European Union that put together 19 municipalities and border territories of European countries, working at the forefront of migration, both in first reception and in integration. Lampedusa is a small island, is the southernmost territory of Italy, is the frontier between Africa and Europe. It's for that Lampedusa municipality started this project. The project developed two kinds of activities. The first is communication and sensitization. We collect and communicate situation in a website, snapshots from the borders.eu. we collect problems, effective solution from the borders, so that citizens can be more informed and aware of consequences of inequalities. We publish tales from the borders, and we have realized sensitization events. The 3rd of October 2019, we have organized 30 capital events in 28 European countries. We were at the time 28, now we are 27. Because the 3rd of October marks the anniversary of what is remembered as one of the most serious massacres of migration in Mediterranean Sea. A boat carrying over 500 people sank when it was just a few hundred meters from the coast of Lampedusa. 368 people, migrants, including children, women, and men, lost their lives. 155 were saved. The 3rd of October is now National Day of Memory of the Victim of Migration in Italy. And we are realizing a second kind of activity that is advocacy, and we realized a petition to make the 3rd of October European Day of Memory of the Migration Victims. We met representatives of the European Union asking for specific measures for borders municipalities, which are daily exposed to the migration emergency and have special needs. And to be welcoming, the communities need to be supported by the central governments, and also they ask for a support from the European institution. The project creates a European border, town and island network. And this group met also Papa Francesco on 10th September, just 1 month ago, and he gave us a private meeting, and he told us inspiring thought. He say that the frontiers, which have always been considered as barriers of separation, can instead become windows, space of mutual knowledge and communion in the diversity. So we are here to discuss about vulnerability in migration. From our point of view, we have to start from the fact that Lampedusa and other border cities are place where thousands and thousands of people have passed over the years. For Lampedusa, it is a geographical fact, as I say. I can give you some figure. In 2011, 51,700 people passed in Lampedusa that has 7,000 inhabitants. In the island, there is a small welcome center that can accommodate about 300 people. Once migrants arrive, they are identified on the border, on the sea, and then they go to the welcome center. Here they have the COVID-19 procedure check, and after a few days they are transferred to a boat, a quarantine boat, for 14 days, and then they go to other reception center in Italy. The Lampedusa citizen and the reception operators in Lampedusa see too often several degrees of vulnerability that is produced by dangerous and traumatic voyages. By staying on border, people experience and see every day that irregular migration creates vulnerability. we see humiliation, violence, inhuman treatment, injuries, disease, and slavery, and also death. The cemetery of Lampedusa has so many people in the graves that arrived through these dangerous voyages. For this reason, the mayor of Lampedusa looked with great hope at the Global Compact for Migration, thinking that this set of rules for orderly, safe, and regular migration proposed by the United Nations can and must be central to this reasoning, because poor and vulnerable people have no other option but to take irregular routes to migrate. And the mayor participated to the Marrakesh Mayoral Forum in December 2018, when he realized that he was the only Italian mayor, the only one to have accepted the invitation. During the last Mayoral Forum in Quito, in 2020, he said that if it is true that man has always been a migrant, our goal should be to make migration an organized, regular, and safe phenomenon. Still within the Snapshot project, we started a process called Global Compact in the municipality, which led the municipality of Lampedusa and Bologna to approve a resolution, a specific resolution that implement the Global Compact guidelines at local level. And we have activated a website through which each administration can download a resolution scheme and find all the useful information. So this is our engagement and really the measure that stay at the border see as in a regular wave of immigration a solution to reduce vulnerability, because they say vulnerability every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for that, and thank you for making it so real, particularly with the example that you gave, because we all know Lampedusa has been in the news for months, kind of thing, since in 2015 and before that, and continues to be. And we know the challenges that you face. But I like some of the things that you have said, how the sensitization programs, the recognition that poor and marginalized people will have to take irregular routes, kind of thing, the response of the mayor, kind of thing, the recognition of the memory of these people who have taken these dangerous routes and come to Lampedusa and then died in Lampedusa or died on the way. Then you have a national day of remembrance for those victims, and I think that's a beautiful example of the kind of sensitization or inclusion or recognizing of migrants as human beings with rights and dignity, is that at least their memory is not lost, they are not forgotten, kind of thing. And I do appreciate what you're doing, and I'm wondering if it is at this level, at the how, and you said you were there in the mayoral forum, kind of thing, in Marrakesh. It would be good to see how this learning in Lampedusa, and maybe in your second round, to have you been able to convince Europe of your approach, so the European Union, and what are the challenges that you as an island have in convincing the European Union that you have the right formula in addressing migration today, or at least the flows coming in that we currently see. But I'll come back to you to give you a chance to think on that question about, and come back to you. In the meantime, before I go to Helen, I know there are people on this call who I'd like to call upon, and if you will be, and I'll put a question to you when I call you and ask you, give you a 1-minute intervention. I see Felix from FES. I'll ask you in a little while to come on. I see Evelyn. I see Wani, I see Hani and Sumita. If I will ask you to come on, I will put a pertinent question to you, and I will give you 1 minute, quick minute response for you to respond to that question. So it's off the cuff. You've got to come up with an answer to that question if that's okay with you when I call you. But now before I do that, let me come to Helen. And Helen, in the work of the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies kind of thing, and we know that that you all are very much engaged in addressing vulnerabilities, populations, not in a certain sense without distinction as well. The way you all reach out to populations of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, whatever that might be, kind of, and the service that you all provide. Do you think that your engagement today in the migration discourse, and particularly in our own region of Asia and the Pacific, uh, your work has helped governments understand more the need for policy change in the current kind of response we have in the region to migrant workers?
Thanks, William. Well, yeah, it's a good question. It's an important question. Yeah, is it making a difference? But yeah, I mean, so much important points have been raised already by the previous speakers. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate, to contribute perspectives from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We're the world's largest humanitarian network, but we're founded on our 17 million community-based volunteers who are working mostly in their own local contexts. We've got a presence around the world in 192 countries. So, with that presence, we're witnessing the enormous suffering that many migrants face during their migration experiences. So we have a presence throughout the migratory routes, before departure, when people are in transit, while people are abroad, and also upon return as well. But as you mentioned, we are an exclusively neutral humanitarian organization. So our aim is to respond to humanitarian needs, to reduce suffering, but without seeking to encourage, discourage, or prevent migration. We had very strong engagement with the negotiations towards the Global Compact on Migration. We came together as a movement with the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and our 192 national societies at the regional, global levels, but also at the national levels as well, involved in many of the negotiations. All the time, we insisted that the compact could not succeed in fostering safe, orderly, and regular migration without also outlining basic minimum standards of human dignity. And this human dignity must be afforded to all migrants, irrespective of their status. So we were calling upon states to respect their obligations under international, as well as their own domestic laws as well. Our advocacy focused on 4 humanitarian priorities. Firstly, that migrants and refugees must be protected throughout their full migratory experience from violence, abuse, and other forms of violations of their fundamental rights. Secondly, that migrants, irrespective of their legal status, must have effective access to essential services and humanitarian assistance. Third, that the rights and needs of the most vulnerable, especially children, must be prioritized. And finally, that detention should only be used as a measure of last resort. Complementing what was just said by Irene from UNICEF and the work of the International Detention Coalition and others. We welcome that these priorities are well captured in the final text of the GCM. And we are now actively urging states to turn their commitments into reality. And we stand ready to support all states in that regard. In particular, we appreciate the recognition of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement as a key stakeholder in paragraph 44 of the Global Compact. And we're encouraging states to partner with their National Red Cross or Red Crescent Society. National societies are auxiliaries to the governments in the humanitarian field. So this can very much speak to the Objective 7 to assess and address vulnerabilities. through understanding the protection and assistance needs of the most vulnerable. Many national societies are already cooperating with local authorities to help identify and understand the vulnerabilities and risks faced by migrants through the networks at the community level, through the branches of Red Cross and Red Crescent located along borders and in other significant locations. And this is what's providing a strong evidence base for our humanitarian diplomacy with governments, and hopefully to inform policy-making decisions. A robust understanding of vulnerability and risk is particularly important during disasters and crises, all disasters and crises, but especially, for example, in the context of COVID-19, where we are seeing responses very much focused on citizens first, and increasingly negative narratives towards non-citizens, migrants, refugees, and stateless people. So ensuring that all people, including migrants, have effective access to essential services is critical to addressing vulnerabilities. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as Patrick has already expanded on, has illuminated and exacerbated the disproportionate risks that migrants face. Since the start of the crisis, and in the global appeal that was launched by the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, migrants and displaced people are a strong focus of our response at the local, national, and regional levels. In our humanitarian diplomacy, we advocate for the necessity of what we call humanitarian service points. These are safe spaces, protection spaces, that ensure that firewall between authorities and service providers to enable migrants to have safe and effective access to the humanitarian services that they need. So this includes access to healthcare, to psychosocial support, to legal support, food, shelter, and information at all stages of migration. I'll share one positive practice example with you from the Maldives, a country where 1 in every 4 people is a migrant. When the government of the Maldives planned to undertake COVID-19 screening of migrant workers, and many of the migrant workers in the Maldives are not in a regular status and might not have current identification documents. The Maldivian Red Crescent immediately engaged in high-level closed-door dialogue, humanitarian diplomacy, as we call it, with their government. And the outcome of this was that they secured an agreement with the government, ensuring that any information collected from migrants would only be shared with the Ministry of Health for the purpose of contact tracing, and that migrants' legal status would not be recorded. In partnership with the local authorities, the Maldivian Red Crescent then established a migrant support center where their volunteers, and they include migrants in their volunteer base, coordinated food distribution, and they operate a COVID-19 call center, a hotline to listen to migrants' own needs and concerns. And in a way, it promotes social cohesion because it includes migrants with their host communities as well. A second example is from the Philippines. The Philippine Red Cross, also in cooperation with their government, established welfare service desks to provide food and non-food items, psychosocial support, and restoring family link services to migrants who were returning to the Philippines from various places. We regard access to information as an essential basic service, and many national societies respond to the need for accurate, accessible, and timely information in an appropriate format, especially for children and for other groups who are most at risk. The Philippine Red Cross has launched something called the Virtual Volunteer. It's a web-based application that puts vital information directly into the hands of those who most need it. So those are prospective migrants, people who are thinking of migrating, those who are away from home, but also the family members of migrants. They can all access information through their cell phone. And the Virtual Volunteer was updated with the most current information about COVID, including the location of quarantine facilities, government advisories, and contact details of other relevant organizations and agencies who support migrant workers while they're abroad and upon return. the Red Cross Red Crescent movement has compiled an open access online library of COVID-19 risk communication, audio and visual materials. And these cover topics including symptoms and treatment, psychosocial support, rumors and stigma, addressing social stigma, hygiene and the correct usage of masks. And all of these materials are available in a wide variety of different languages and are easily accessible to anyone who needs them. I can share the link with you all. And the idea is that these resources would, in a way, reduce risks for migrants who might otherwise be hard to reach. So through international cooperation and partnerships, we recognize that it is important to work together. We remind governments that they don't need to act alone towards meeting the objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. It's an opportunity for us as the Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies to engage with our governments on the safety, the dignity and the rights of migrants. And we're using it as an opportunity to showcase and build upon the work that's already underway in other areas, for example, in disaster risk reduction, in social cohesion. But there are areas for improvement. There are also gaps. And this means that the authorities, that the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and other stakeholders, we must all coordinate our efforts to assess and address the humanitarian needs of migrants in vulnerable situations. But it's also essential that, that national societies, that all humanitarian actors have the necessary space and access to assist all those who are in need. I'll leave it there. Thanks, William. Back to you.
Thanks, Helena. Let me quickly just get back to you and ask you. You've pointed out gaps and challenges at coordination, one, and the need to work together, the other. But what else is not happening for you? Because in many ways, yours is the biggest humanitarian organization. In a time like this, and in the context that we are talking about vulnerabilities, your organization would be the organization that would that should not have a problem in terms of being able to do its work. So if you were to pin down your biggest challenge today, kind of thing, in addressing this issue, like for example in different contexts, let's say in Yemen or in Bangladesh with the Rohingya population, or what is the big challenge you face today?
I'd go back to those last points that I made and say that access is definitely a challenge, and it's particularly difficult in the context of health pandemics, where social distancing measures, physical distancing measures, movement restrictions prohibit the mechanisms that we would otherwise use to reach people, which is to use our network of local volunteers at the village level, at the community level, to reach migrants who themselves often intentionally stay out of reach, or by virtue of the work that they're doing or the locations in which they're living are hard to reach anyway. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, has for many organizations, not just for us, but is actually that access. But on a more kind of formal level, the other barriers that we're seeing are the restrictions on providing essential services to non-citizens, and particularly to irregular migrants as well. And that example I gave from the Maldives just shows how important this closed-door dialogue that we are often able, but not always able, to have with governments about ensuring that humanitarian imperatives, humanitarian principles are upheld, and the importance of that testing and treatment, and hopefully soon a vaccine, are accessible to all, because as Patrick quoted, we're not all safe until everyone is safe. And so that really does speak to the importance of ensuring that there is not discrimination in the treatment and services that are provided to everybody in a country's territory.
Let me put another pointed question to you then. Do you see a lot more political openness for the work that you all do with migrants, considering that we know that migrants are seen as the other marginalized communities? And do you see that for a humanitarian organization like yours, spread across the world with chapters around the world kind of thing, do you see a lot more political openness, or do you see this window shrinking or the space shrinking? That is at the political level, at the societal level, at the social level. Do you see, what Sandra was talking about, greater sensitization to your work, and so at the societal level, greater welcoming kind of for your operations? Are these, what I'm saying is for the kind of work you do, and particularly with migrants, do you see an expansion and appreciation and openness, or do you see it as a challenge like so many other NGOs in this field look at who are involved in rights-based work?
It varies. I mean, from context to context. I'd say, starting off on a positive note, yes, we have seen more political will, and finally the recognition of the importance of the inclusion of non-citizens, of migrants in COVID response in particular. Thailand is a great example. The Thai Red Cross launched a project at the beginning of the COVID situation here, directly to reach migrant workers, in cooperation and coordination with those that already had strong networks, because the Thai Red Cross did not, by their own admission. It's not a population with whom they had been targeting their activities up until now. But they brought together key civil society organizations. They are working closely, of course, with the Royal Thai government, and through the network of Red Cross chapters across the country, are able to reach migrant workers with personal protection equipment and with information. We've also seen other national societies taking up activities to reach migrants in their communities as well, that hadn't otherwise. Malaysian Red Crescent is another example. But at the societal level, I think it is also very varied as well. As we all know, there is increasing discrimination, xenophobia, and hate speech around migrants and non-citizens in COVID response as well. So a big challenge and a big part of our work is addressing this social stigma, being sure that the messages that the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies give are the trusted source, that are able to balance some of the other negative narratives that are circulating. So that's a constant challenge and struggle, counterbalancing some of the other negative narratives that are out there, and at the same time maintaining access.
Thanks a lot for that, and that is true. I like that you pointed it out, that the xenophobic kind of language, racist language, the increasing xenophobia that we see today in this time of the COVID as well is a challenge, and it adds to the vulnerabilities. Thank you for that. And let me come back to you, Ignacio. You were talking about protections in the design of building back. How would you go about that? How do you think policy makers should go about that?
I think perhaps the first point is to remind, and also because we're talking about potentials and so on, is to remind that vulnerabilities are mainly constructed by states in the policies and in the practices. And there is an increased concerning situation. It's around border control, the interception measures, restrictive migration, and asylum rules. So really important when we talk about vulnerability is that a lot is linked to that. So it is important to talk about the potentials, and that's certainly one of my 4 fundamentals in the building back better. But that language around vulnerabilities and the reasons why people find themselves in vulnerable situations, it's because of policies, it is because of rules that are applied. It's not some of it is the environment, but that's why it's so important to continue insisting on those overlaying levels of vulnerability. The potentials, one, certainly in the building back better, is certainly to put people in the center and that they are part of the solutions. The contribution that people make, and specifically around migrants, there are so many cases that do show, even just for the health services, how it's migrant workers that have been giving in a number of countries the response, or are giving the response to some of this. And we really have to find and continue pushing the way for the barriers that are put are for these people to be able to express fully their potential, are openness, the accreditation of their qualifications, and is exploring different models of regularization pathways. So that's one point. One is one that has already been mentioned on by Patrick, and I think Helen also mentioned it. It's the one that no one is safe until everybody is safe, and that is something absolutely clear, and which a pandemic offers the opportunity to go further in pushing the model further. One is that the recovery efforts, and especially for these people on the move, they have to be included in the response. If we want a safe situation, and in terms of public health, if we want diagnosis, treatment, vaccines, for all that to work, it has to be universally accessible. And the discussion around the vaccines is just going to become even more central in the discussions in the months to come for this universal access to vaccines. The third one is that absolutely human rights of people, of migrants, of people on the move more broadly, and a response to COVID-19 are not mutually exclusive. The things can go together. There are measures that have to be taken for safety reasons linked to the pandemic. They have to be proportionate. They have to be short in time and not being perpetuated, as a lot of the concerns are. The fourth element is around what you also talking about, William, and where a lot of insistence has to be. It's around the inclusion, or if you take it in the other way round, how exclusion in the long term is going to be so costly. It pays off to respond now to humanitarian situations, to situations of migrants in vulnerable situations. What is going to happen once the routes, the migration routes, are going to be a bit more possible? We haven't spoken much about the African continent on the examples that we have given. And we do hear, well, the pandemic, the COVID-19 is hitting less strongly the African continent. Wait a second, perhaps the disease, but not all the shadow crisis, the shadow pandemics that go with it, the one on gender-based violence, the one on hunger, and certainly this is going to push even more people to be moving. So I think on those four key elements to build better, insisting again that if we don't invest now, it's going to cost much more in the future. And even yeah, William, you want me to go through the? You want me to stop?
No, I was going to say thank you for that, and I will take you on the 4 points. And I like how you constructed those, in the sense of the first point is the most important, the realization that a lot of the vulnerabilities is constructed by the states, and and as I ask you to come on to the end, I will ask you to reflect upon this as well. If your first point is that vulnerabilities are constructed by the states, then is there any hope of vulnerabilities being fully addressed or really addressed? Because a lot of what the states do is political.
Mm.
A lot of what governments do is political. And since 2015, we have seen this discussion on migrants get more and more and more politicized.
Mm.
Elections are fought and lost on this. So if vulnerabilities is a construction of the state, then I'm interested to see what is the hope you're going to come with
Mhm.
at the end of
Mhm.
this conversation,
Mhm. Mhm.
given the current climate we live in. But let me go to the 1 minute kind of round now, and I see Felix. Felix, are you there? Felix from FES.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great to have you on the on this webinar. What were you hoping to hear and you did not hear in this webinar?
No, I think it was a really comprehensive look around the world. I mean, um, I think you covered a lot of topics. Maybe I would, I mean, you covered not so much the European discourse or the German discourse, but this is all right. No, you still give me 1 minute, right? I still have
I
to
still give
think.
you 1 minute. Yeah, that's why it was off the cuff answers.
No, I think the last idea of this construction of vulnerability is really important in all kinds of dimensions, because we see it in Germany as well, in the meat industry, you know, the big scandals. But it's always a question of regulation of labor markets and what is the state is doing in this kind of area. So this is a really, I mean, it's more of a takeaway, would I say, for me also to always see vulnerabilities from this perspective. Yes.
And thank you for that, because Germany has been in some ways a leader of what, and I asked Sandra this question earlier, has Lampedusa been able to convince European Union? I'll put this question to you: has your Germany finally managed to convince the European Union of its response to this crisis in 2015 that led eventually to the Global Compact?
Yes. You mean the current reaction to the Moria crisis?
No,
Or?
just the whole initial response of Germany to the movements in 2015. Have you all, do you all, looking back, do you all think, because there was a recent kind of documentary on Germany, looking back and seeing whether it made the right decision or not? What is your assessment?
I think we totally made the right decision in 2015 in the late summer to not close the borders to the Balkan region. I think this was really detrimental and showed that there is some kind of humanity left and some values left in the European Union and region. But still, I mean, we are still we are fighting with the struggling with the consequences right now to find a common European asylum policy and find some compromise between the south and the north, the west and the east. And right now, I mean, you might heard about the European asylum and migration package, which is now on the table, for the package from the European Commission. And it's going to be a really tough negotiations to find some compromise, and I think nobody will like this compromise. It will be a foul thing. I think. I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but seeing the package, you can already assume that the outcome will be less what we expect. Yeah.
That is what the initial reviews of the pact is actually saying at the moment. But I think that's, and I think this is good that we, liked your response that looking back, it was the right decision to make. Of course, millions or hundreds of migrant workers, hundreds of people seeking in that desperate situation needed that kind of support. And we hope y'all will, that this notion of solidarity is something that will continue to grow and we will continue to struggle with. Wani, are you here? Wani from Migrant Rights Org? Okay. Sumita? Sumita, Wani, no? All right. Let me.
Sumita is there, but I think some audio issue.
Audio issue. Okay. Let me come to Evelyn. Evelyn, your comments on what you've been hearing?
Thanks, William. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to go back to 2 weeks ago and throw out the proposition that if Objective 5 is the keystone objective, Objective 7 is the catch-up objective. That without migration governance based on rights respecting regular pathways for those who need them and reflecting demand for migrant workers' labor, we are indeed doing protectionist catch-up. And that's reflected in the very first action under Objective 7, which I think Ignacio might have already mentioned, reviewing relevant policies and practices to ensure that they do not create, exacerbate, or unintentionally increase vulnerabilities of migrants, including by applying a human rights-based, gender and disability responsive, as well as age and child-sensitive approach. So the first thing I'd say about that is that there are effective protectionist catch-up responses, and there are 12 of them under that objective. And a bunch of the speakers today have talked about ways to elaborate these to address and reduce the wide range of vulnerabilities. And then I'm going to say, last thing I'm going to say is that I really wish that Objective 7 had been the immediate go-to point of departure for responding to the situation of migrants in the pandemic, recognizing all of the constraints on how much governments could accomplish with lockdowns and how quickly, it still would have been a really great reference point. And I think working on this, and especially the non-discrimination and inclusion aspect, will be really, really important to building back better and being able to move forward to the keystone objective of 5 of safe, rights respecting regular migration pathways. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Evelyn. And I like that because Ellen also raised, in her intervention earlier, she talked about making the migrants and countries in crisis, that was there anything or is there anything within that framework that governments could have gone to see how to respond to the situation of migrants in this pandemic. And I like what you are saying now, that this could have been the objective that governments could have zeroed in seeing how to respond to migrants in this during this pandemic. And we might still want to unpack that with governments. The pandemic, there is no saying how long this is going to continue. People are talking of a second wave already coming in, and so it would be interesting to see how we can take this objective, unpack it with governments, and say this was your commitment, and like Helen said earlier, translate commitment into action, kind of thing. This might be something to think of from an action point coming out of this webinar for all of us who are in this and involved in advocacy, is let us look at this objective 7, and sit down with governments and see how they have been addressing it, because there is a framework in there. But Ellen, what do you think of that as you're listening, as you've heard some of the other speakers and looked at some of the chat box? What are you thinking at this stage? Ellen?
Me. Yeah, you mean me, not
Yes,
Helen.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm getting deaf already from these webinars. Yeah. So yeah, what are my thoughts on this? Can things be changed? I think yes, as you want to say or remind us many times, change is upon us. So how do you do that? So I think we've come up with words to describe migrant workers, that they are essential workers. They are frontline workers. They are actually indispensable workers. So they can always take the bluff that, okay, we don't need you. No, if they probably get rid of one migrant nationality, but they will take on another. So the whole thing is like they would need workers because they lack the workers. And I think this is part of the narrative that goes with GCM, that these workers are not a burden to the societies that they go into. They actually contribute tremendously to their development, so economic, and not only economic but socially as well. So I think it's upon us to make sure that this build back better would be something safer and fairer, to use the project of the safe and fair for migrants, and especially for women migrants. And I just would like to go back to the issue of the women migrant workers, because also not because also I heard Felix making an intervention, because there is this campaign globally, and this is initiated by several groups actually, but FES is one, on the future of care work, on care work. And of course the hashtag is, if there's one category of work that is with enduring all these challenges around us, it's care work. So as we say, the future is care work, but we can only make it better if we also aligned it with the hashtag that the future is feminist. So I think one is not like don't do the care work. Somebody has got to do it. And states are when they see workers desperate for jobs, they take advantage of that to provide lesser and lesser allocation for care work that the state should be primarily responsible for. So I mean, taking care of the elderly and the young people in the community, and the people with disabilities, it becomes very easy for them. Let's take these migrant workers, these care workers from the Philippines, from Indonesia, and it comes more cheap, than for the state to provide that. So I think that should not be the new normal. Yeah, there will be additional vulnerabilities for sure, and that's why I think the phrasing of the GCM Objective 7 is not to totally eliminate it, because maybe it's going to be very, very challenging, considering that still the framing of a lot of things around us is nation state. So first and foremost, has to be, the laws that are made to express the rights are always like the priority would be the nationals. But then of course it doesn't mean that the countries of destination are not open to extending rights and recognizing the rights of the migrant workers. But that is something that we have to really continuously work on, especially for the low wage, and especially for the women workers who are always like disproportionately disadvantaged. And I think at this time, what the COVID pandemic has taught us is, let us use this as a leverage. They are essential workers. So they should be given the same equality. They should be able to enjoy equality of treatment. They should be able to enjoy treatment with dignity for our migrant workers. So not only about our own migrant workers from the Philippines. And then I think, if I may go back, William, to the earlier question that you posed to me, like the power play between origin and destination country. I would say, because Philippines has been into this migration phenomenon for more than 45 years. And people from government, the retired people from government would candidly really admit that, especially in the earlier years, there will always be this power play. Like the countries of destination will say, we will get all these other types of workers if you will also allow us to get the domestic workers. But this is like in the context of the fact that so many of our domestic workers are already experiencing a lot of this maltreatment, abuses, and exploitation. So whenever there were attempts by Philippine government to address the issue, and one of the easy recourses to do that is to stop the deployment, the country of destination will say, oh, you do that and we will not take in all the other workers from the Philippines. So I think for many years that was one dilemma that the Philippine government was saying. But interestingly, as you would observe, perhaps in the recent years, of course, government still resorts to deployment ban, particularly for domestic workers. But you will note that on the part of the recruitment agencies here, there is like a bit of trying to observe the policy of the government that okay, this is going to be temporary until we are able to sort out this thing with this particular country of destination. And I think we've seen that in some of the cases in the recent years. Except of course, we still have this deployment ban in Lebanon, which is really like it did not decrease the number of migrant workers, but it has increased, in fact, for several times. But I don't know what with a lot of the economic difficulties, of course, that the Lebanon is going through now, even prior to the bombings and all that. We've heard a lot of requests for assistance for repatriation of many of our domestic workers. But anyway, so just to go back to the topic, can things be better for migrant workers, and particularly for the migrant workers? It's all upon us. And I think we have all the ingredients. We have finally come up with, non-binding as it may be, a framework that is still based on rights, and gender responsiveness, being child sensitive, culturally sensitive. So it's all there. It's not something unknown to us. So I think all we need to do is grab it, and let's still continue with this ambitious national response, because at the end of the day, it's the national governments that will have to implement it, could make all these things concrete. So national and also the local governments, I would add, because we've been engaging a lot with our local governments in the Philippines.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I am able to respond to your question, but
No,
that's
no,
it from my end. Thank you.
that's a good one. But I like your optimism also that it's all up to us. And I'm assuming when you're saying all up to us, you're in that UN lingo of all of society. So I'll accept it as that, all up to us. Irene, any thoughts on the question I posed
Yes.
to you?
So maybe let me rephrase it. And I think what you mean is like how we move from paper to practice, really. So how we move from pilot to scale so that we don't have any migrant child in the world in a situation of vulnerability, or at least a critical mass of children facing no vulnerability, right? And here, maybe I'll just offer some leads. Of course, there is no silver bullets. And I think we need to think short term and react quickly to seize specific windows of opportunity that are political or social, like we have seen with the pandemic, at least earlier this spring. And we need to think long term. I have a vision for the next decade or the next 20 years that is ambitious, but is grounded in reality. And I think we need to start by identifying what is at the core of the lack of progress that we see in addressing vulnerabilities, or the lack of critical mass that you were mentioning, and you're right to mention that. And I think it's the fact, as I was saying earlier, that societies consider some things unacceptable for their children, but tolerate them in the case of migrant and refugee children. And of course, this is rooted in xenophobia and discrimination and so on. And here we see issues like detention, like family separation, like lack of access to services, like living in unsanitary conditions in the middle of a global pandemic, as we've seen in Moria, at the door of Europe, etc. And I think the governments can only go as far as their constituents let them, at least in most countries. And we have seen how quickly some governments have backtracked when there was real outrage from society. And this is especially when children are involved. See, for example, the family separation policy of the US, or think about the drowning of Aylan Kurdi in 2015. But again, of course, the outrage about the extreme instances of vulnerability that happen every 2 years does not take us very far. And it is only effective for risk mitigation, but not really to move us forward. So in constructing and reaching that critical mass, I think there are several strategies that we can try. And of course, we try them all at the same time, at least from the perspective of UNICEF. First is starting with the solutions that exist. And many of these are at the local level, as Ellen was saying. And I think it's important that we replicate them and connect local and national levels and support both levels of government to adapt to their context and to bring these solutions to scale. Connecting local level across borders, national level across borders, and of course, bringing all of the actors that are relevant and that can implement the solutions to the table. The second strategy is bringing together communities, because it's really the only sustainable way to include children. And really the vision of the GCM and the vision of the Global Compact for Refugees is really that, is inclusion of children. I mean, children and migrants in general, if you read what's behind it clearly. And of course, the policies won't be inclusive unless there is public support for inclusive policies. And this is best done or best started at the local level, at least piloting. So maybe, from the UNICEF side, we have had several public engagement initiatives that are still ongoing, where we try to bring migrant and refugee and local children together, get them to know each other, and use this way to also connect their families and their broader communities, etc. But we are not engaging them through the perspective of vulnerability. We're just trying to show also their potential and the strengths. And we are not engaging with the usual suspects who are liberal and support migration. And we are not engaging with the anti-migrant public, but with what we call the movable middle, those who don't really care about migration, but care about family and values and nation, who can be convinced that migrants belong in their societies. Then another strategy is to focus on unlocking potential, as I was saying. So stop with the narrative that presents children as vulnerable others, because as I was saying, they only mobilize short-term support and then people forget about it. And we need to highlight everything that makes migrants like us, that make them belong. And I think here it's less tangible to keep insisting on the economic contributions that migrants make to society, because people don't think or don't vote that way. We need to find ways to break that through other kinds of arguments that are not always rational and are not always based on hard facts. And I think in general, as community, we should not be just satisfied with having a few safeguards that protect children on the surface, but then don't give them a future. Because after they turn 18, they're going to be sent back to their country of origin because they don't have protective status anymore. So just as a final thought to, for all of us to reflect on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, and thank you for that program that you mentioned of just bringing children together without irrespective of who, like national refugees, migrants, kind of thing. I think that could be a beautiful program, because children don't have the concepts that we have in our minds as adults, kind of thing, that this is a migrant child, a refugee child. Children are children, and they will come together without these barriers in their mind. And the more we get them to come together in that kind of space, I think that there is a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah.
So I think it would be great to see an expansion of programs like that.
And here, just to mention, we are not creating these programs as programs focused on including migrant children. They are a sports program. They are cooking, they're arts, they are, doing video games together. The word migration is not mentioned in these programs. It's not about including migrant children. It's just about creating opportunities for children to interact without bringing migration to the fore, and through that, bringing communities together.
I've seen, yes, and that's good. And I've seen that program with, not of UNICEF, but of some civil society organizations in South Korea doing programs like that, just cooking programs, basically, which is very helpful. Sandra, if I can come to you now, and I asked you that question, have you been able to convince Europe that you have a winning formula in how you have addressed? I asked Felix that a little while ago, and he said the Germans had shown this kind of leadership in 2015. And so you have Germany showing that kind of leadership. You have at the local level, Lampedusa. Between Germany and Lampedusa, is there a way of a new European reckoning in how to deal with this issue, or come to terms with this issue, and come to maybe even accept this issue?
Yes, we are working on that. We met the President of European Parliament, Antonio Tajani, 2 years ago, And we propose our idea of the European Day on the 3rd of October, and all the partners are working with their national members of European Parliament. So we are working on that. We met also other members in the European Committee of the Regions, and we hope that we will organize a meeting in Brussels if the COVID-19 will allow us to do it. I would like just to say that I totally agree with Ignacio. Vulnerability is created by state, and in the border we suffer this situation. I would like just to give an example from Italy. In 2018, a government law made by Minister Salvini abolished the residency permit on humanitarian grounds for refugees, for asylum seekers. This abolition created, by one estimate, more than 3,700 people that became undocumented since 2018 because humanitarian permits were abolished. So the state, the law can create undocumented people and that are vulnerable people. Now, last week, the new government adopted another law that re-established this residency permit that now is called special protection. The permit is for the people who don't qualify for asylum, but who shouldn't be sent away because they will face a risk of torture or inhuman treatment. So the permit is also for people who have family or social links in Italy. This is a quite new thing for Italy, that we recognize the social and familiar links that for the migrants are very important, and allow the state also not to spend too much money, because vulnerability is create expenditure for the state, because a very vulnerable person cannot be lived on the street. This situation implies a lot of cost for the social services. So this is quite good news from Italy. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a very interesting realization in terms of that kind of permit, to recognize that it does ease the burden of the state in terms of looking after the people in these kind of contexts, but to share the cost within the social network of family and friends and community that might be there. It's an interesting thing and it might be worth looking at. We have run out of time, and so I will ask for Patrick, any last thought first?
Yeah, I suppose, no, we don't have much time left, but just to finish off, we've talked a lot about the vulnerabilities and what hope there is. I think, the reality is that we've never before seen, an illness like COVID spread so fast and so far around the world. We've never seen such an impact on migration and migrants, but at the same time, we've never seen such attention to these populations coming to the fore. And if only there was some sort of global framework that has already been agreed to that presents a roadmap for how countries can address this, wouldn't that be wonderful? And luckily there is that. And so I think now is the time to really, build on the GCM and on the the momentum that is growing behind that, and the realization that, as we've been saying, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and that inclusion saves money and exclusion costs lives and costs more money in the long run. And I think, just to finish off, I know that Objective 7 is focused solely on vulnerabilities, but we also need to think about what capacities exist. in order to address those vulnerabilities. The capacities of migrants themselves and of their communities, capacities of civil society and society at large to be able to address those, and the capacities of governments and the organizations supporting the GCM, and how those can be leveraged to address that vulnerability. And I think now is the time. The COVID pandemic is still in the beginning phases. This is going to be a long-term recovery, and although we've seen a few good examples and not widespread adoption of addressing these vulnerabilities, now is the time to start helping governments really to support those vulnerabilities in the short, medium, and long term, because this is going to be a long-term recovery for everyone, and hopefully a recovery that will end up in a better situation and less vulnerabilities in the long term.
And thank you for echoing that. You've echoed what Evelyn said, that we have the framework. It's a question of picking it up and looking at it and implementing it. Like Helen says, commitment into translate commitment into action. Ignacio, your message of hope?
Yes, I just put it on the chat box because I was about to leave due to time. The mission, it's your question. Of course, we will not change the fact that migration is a political issue and that it will be taken and pushed by different groups. However, we really have to put protection in the center and bring it at community level. This is how inclusiveness can be created, accountability and an equitable response can be brought. We just have to hear how Sandra explained the situation of Lampedusa. We also have to look at a number of examples that are brought from local authorities. When you're in the situation and you have to, for peace sake, if that's the only reason, you have to accommodate a very diverse community in your village, in your city, you find the operational responses. And this is so far away from some of the policy makers at central level. So that is where investment has to be done. And this is to respond on the question of how do we make sure that we don't have disruptive administrations in a number of countries that would disrupt the efforts at community level. That's also my message of hope, is to go back and look at local level. Localization is the key element, and working with the people that are most affected by the different situations. Yeah.
Thank you, Ignacio, for that message. And it is true. Sandra said that. Helen said that in her testimony of the Red Crescent Red Cross societies. Ellen said that as well. So it is definitely, and Patrick said that in terms of capacities. So great. Let me finish this first by thanking you, and let me just do a very quick round, because I think the world needs to heal. We've suffered a pandemic from which we would have never imagined last year that the world would go through this. And so I want each one of you who has been on the panel, one word for us coming out of the pandemic. What would that one word be? Let me start with you, Patrick. One word.
Inclusion.
Inclusion. Ignacio? Okay, Ignacio is left, I think. Irene?
Reimagine.
Reimagine. Ellen? Ellen?
I'm mute. Okay. Dignity.
Dignity. Dignity. That's 3 words, Ellen.
Dignity.
Sandra?
Respect.
Respect. And Helen?
Cooperation.
Cooperation. Let's take those, for those of us who are still on this call, let's take those words. We have had a fantastic discussion today, I believe, in which we have looked at how SDGs 16 and the principle of leaving no one behind, and the notion of inclusion, respect, dignity, cooperation, how all this can come together in GCM Objective 7 when we start addressing the vulnerabilities of migrants, marginalized populations, and people that need assistance and service. It would be great if we I like somebody in the chat box who has put compassion is my word, and thank you for that. Yes, I think listening to Sandra, listening to Helen, and the other panelists, kind of thing, I think we really need to go back to GCM 7, recognize that, and start picking this up as with states in a dialogue with states to say, let's start addressing this. Because when we start picking up those left behind and we start addressing those left behind as our first interest of concern, kind of thing, I think we are then putting the foundations for a new world, which the GCM does envision in that sense. For the first time, the UN coming up with what we call as the most comprehensive framework to address this, and let's move forward with those words and those thoughts in mind. Thank you all for being part of the webinar today. Thank you to the panelists for making your time. We have enjoyed this. I have enjoyed it. There has been some fantastic insights, and I look forward to us continuing to work together to make this a realization. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, William.